Where were you at in 92, 93 at the time that you volunteered to go over?
Yeah, 92, that's when, if I recall correctly, that's when the first call came out for people to deploy to Croatia. And there were a whole bunch of Calgary Hounders and a ton of King's Own who put in. I believe two of our guys got the okay to go on tour. I wasn't one of those. And I got a taste for, when you put your name into something that big, it triggers something inside of you. And getting that no was kind of it stayed with me. So I made that decision at that point that the next time a tour came along, I would put my name in and would do whatever I could to get onto that tour. So that's between 92 and the end of 93 when my tour came up. I really I took courses. I did a lot of Class B, and I kind of put the rest of my life on hold for a little bit. And then at the end of 93, the call came out for Roto 3 Alp Cavalier in Bosnia, Lower Strathcona Battle Group Tour. And obviously that helped my chances quite a bit, being a black hatter myself. So late 93, we started doing some pre-training in the armories, and early 94, we moved into what was then Curry for a month and a half, and then we went over to the Strathconas afterwards, and we did our pre-deployment training there, and we deployed in May 1994.
So why did you want to deploy? What was you had to be a volunteer as a reservist, so why?
I think a lot of us are join the military because we're looking for something different, and we're looking for something that's meaningful. And that's what I noticed when I put my name in for that Croatia tour, was that just that act alone of signing up for something really gave your life in that period of time meaning and a purpose that you really couldn't get anywhere else. One of the reasons I put my name in is because we could see the machinations around us, in the news and talk in the army floor, and that this is something that was blowing up. This was something that was going to be big, and where Canada could really play a pivotal role, and that we as the tools of that policy could really have an impact, and at the same time, give us a kind of meaning that none of us really had. Up to that point, most of the tours that you saw on people's chests on their medals were Cyprus or Golan Heights. This seemed altogether different. And again, as a soldier, you train very hard to do the job for real. I always say it's like being in a football team, and you practice every single day without ever going to the game. And this was a chance of putting those skills and all that work and all that dedication. Because even as a reservist, the dedication that goes into serving is quite high, and some would argue even more so because you are balancing so many things. So to put that kind of dedication and work and effort into it, and not to have at least a chance to do the job to a certain degree to what you train, is I think it's something that a lot of guys, they can't really sit with, and I was one of those guys that we worked really hard. We believed in the job, and we believed in our training, and we wanted to be part of that bigger picture that we were seeing in the news and all that talk of the army floor, and this was the way to do it.
So what did you hope, on a very personal level, what did you hope that this tour was going to do for you? Like sort of your end state at the end of the tour. What did you hope that would be?
Yeah, it's a gamut. It runs a gamut. It starts from the very basic sense of adventure to go over there and see the world, and to live by the gun, so to speak, and to be part of a team, and to live experiences that none of my peers would see except those in uniform. It also ran into a little bit of a deeper level in that I felt very strongly that I wanted to give back. The story there is that I and my family are refugees. We were taken into Canada running away from some very nasty stuff. And the fact alone that Canada would let me serve in their military was huge for me. And then that I could give something back was also tremendous. I felt very strongly that I needed to give something back. And then there's that bigger picture. I'm a little bit of a political junkie, and to see the machinations and everything that was going on in the Balkans, and how you see kind of this this pivotal point where, you know, the Cold War meets modern pressure and neoliberalism, and bringing it all together and blowing up into this really ugly episode in modern Europe, and to be part of that and to kind of help shape it in a more positive view and along, you know, according to Canadian policy, which to this day I still believe very strongly that I think we are a very advanced and very socially oriented social policy as part of what we are as a nation. So yeah, I wanted to go over there and see what we could do as part of that instrument of policy that our government holds, and in a very young mind think that we could go over there and make a significant difference. I think we could make a difference at a personal level and perhaps a tactical level, but obviously, you know, geostrategic messes are way bigger than a battle group or even one mission. So those were my hopes. Looking back, I realize now that they were probably a little bit too idealistic, but so it goes.
You mentioned your family and your family circumstances. What did your family and friends say when you told them that you had volunteered to go to Bosnia?
Well, the story goes back a little bit more with my family. When I wanted to join the Army, I was 17, so obviously my parents had to allow me to sign. My mom refused. She cried, and she looked at me for the first time like I was becoming the enemy, that those people that terrorized our family, that broke apart our family, I was taking on that mantle rather than the mantle that my family hoped that I would take. So that very much framed most of my early military career, was this struggle that my mom had of loving me and hating what I did. My dad, being a supportive father, he, you know, through tears signed the paper, and it was his signature that I ended up using to enroll. So then when I told my folks that I put in for the Croatia tour, Mom came pretty close to having a coronary. She had a little bit of a mental breakdown, and she didn't handle it well. Still, being a young, selfish person like most young men are, I was determined to do it again after it was turned down. So then when late '93 came around and they asked for volunteers, I volunteered again, but I didn't tell anybody. My fear was that if, again, I didn't get this tour, that it would stress out my mom and, you know, give her another breakdown, and it would be for nothing. So we did all the pre-training, and I hate to say it, I lied to my mom about what I was doing. We even deployed to California for a month, and again, I lied about that as well. And it was about 3 weeks before deployment that I came clean and told her that this is what I had been working towards, and that was deploying. By then, I think it became real for her, and it was obviously very difficult, and she found it very hard to make peace with it. But you know that the parental instinct kicked in, and she was more concerned about my well-being and that I would be okay, rather than being very upset with me for my bad life choices. So it's been a journey with her for sure. My dad has always been nothing but steadfast. You know, he's never been a cheerleader about this, but he's been extremely supportive. And then when it comes to my friends, you know, it's funny. As years go by, I've had more friends reach out to me, especially the last couple Remembrance Days, high school friends. You know, that you know, life takes you apart. You don't really hear from one another for a long time. And two of them have reached out and basically said that they so wanted to be me back then, and they never found a way to put themselves in that situation, and they've sat with it for a long time. You know, we never talked about it, and I never knew how they felt about any of this. We got together after a tour, you know, for a couple of beers, kind of a thing, and we talked about it, and then life went on. But like I said, over the last couple of years, two different individuals have reached out and said that they looked up to what we did, and they hoped that that could have been them, and it's something that they live with now, that they were so close that they could have, you know, done it themselves, because I'm one of them. I'm no different, you know, and that if I could do it, they could have done it, but they They just couldn't take that step to do it, and it's something they live with. And I think it's ridiculous. We'll make our choices and we'll do the best we can with the lives that we lead. And they have beautiful lives themselves, full of meaning and understanding, and they do the best they can. But I guess it's something that they hold, that they wish they could have done and they would have done, and they hold that against themselves that they didn't. It's strange.
What's the culture in your unit at the time that you're doing this? Like, were there a whole bunch of people in the King's Own that volunteered for the same Op Cavalier tour?
Yeah. I think at the end for Cavalier we had 24 or 25 guys deploy. Again, I think what helped was there was a little bit of a boiling kettle effect in the Army floor, because Croatia had already been going for a couple of years, and Bosnia was blowing up, and it was all over the news. And then when they announced the armored battle group, that I think piqued a lot of the guys' interests, because as you know, most of the battle groups are infantry centric. This was an armor centric battle group, and as it turns out, the Strathconas themselves had just somewhat melded in with the 8th 8th Canadian Hussar, who were posted in Germany until 1993, and they were disbanded as a regular force unit, and that unit was basically split evenly amongst the Strathconas and the RCDs. Why this is important is because then half the Strathconas who deployed on that tour were not Cougar qualified. They were Leopard trained crewmen. So they get to Edmonton, or to Calgary at the time. They get to Calgary and they're given these new vehicles, the Cougars, and they've never seen them before. They don't know how to work them. So that's when the reserves came in. So the fact that the King's Own were also here in Calgary, and we knew a lot of Strathconas as it was, there was a little bit of there was a little bit of camaraderie, the understanding between the two units, but also there was the understanding that we knew the platform and they didn't. So for one, there was, and probably the only time that I can recall, there was almost a want on behalf of the Strathconas to have us in there, because they knew they didn't have enough personnel to man 2 full squadrons of Cougars with what they had. So for example, I was part of B Squadron 2 troop. Our troop was mainly 8CH, which meant that most of the gunners and drivers on that troop were reservists. Half of them were King's Own. All the crew commanders and senior gunners were 8CH, but the guys actually using the machinery were King's Own or other reserve units from Western Canada. So leading up to that, there was a lot of excitement in the unit. I think everybody who could deploy ended up deploying, and those who put in that didn't get a tour, basically there was a good reason for it, either financial circumstances or physical or medical, that kind of a thing. But anybody who was healthy and who was qualified to go basically ended up going. And if I recall correctly, it was either 24 or 25 guys from the King's Own who deployed on that tour alone.
So, on a personal level, how were you as reservists? Maybe you can sort of talk a bit about what were relations like at that time between Regs and Reserves, and how were you received by the Strathcona Battle Group when you showed up?
Yeah, there's always two layers to that, right? There's the official layer where the CO stands in front of everybody and makes you feel like you're, the saviors, that the tour isn't going without you, and they really appreciate you being there, and that always feels very good. But then there's always also the personal dynamic, when you come across the pushback from regular force. I mean, it is a culture that there's pushback. There's not exactly a lot of respect between the regular and reserve. So we saw that as well. I think for my squadron it was a little bit different, because, like I said, it was mostly an 8CH squadron, rebadged Strathcona, but an 8CH squadron. So most of them had never really worked with the reservists. So there was a little bit of I guess a little bit of distrust. Not because of what they heard or what they knew of reservists, but simply because we were an unknown entity. They've been in Germany for the last 4 years. Most of these guys have been strictly regular force. Most of them joined and went straight to Germany. And even the senior guys had lived in this bubble where reservists weren't really a thing for them. So there was a little bit of distrust when we first came in, because they didn't know what we brought to the table. But again, I think what helped in our circumstance was the fact that they were in a platform they didn't understand, and things broke and it was us, who came in along and fixed it, and they couldn't figure out the gunnery system and it was us who, showed them their way through the gunnery system. So we depended a lot on their leadership and their planning, and they depended on us for the labor and for the technical skill. So I think it jived quite well. That said, like I said, there's always the odd Strathcona who has a chip on his shoulder and needs to feel better by knocking down a reservist. So we saw that as well. I didn't see it as much as I've seen it in other contexts, like when you go to the battle schools or you go deploy on other tours. You see a lot more of that, distrust or we're just needing to peg reserves down a couple steps, so to speak. We did see a little bit of it. That said, the reservists who didn't perform, they did get a pretty hard ride, but it was very easy if you did your job well and you were dedicated to it to be let in and to be accepted as one of the crews. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, it was that tour was different in that aspect. Is that it's one of those rare times when they really did need what we brought to the table. But you still see it. There were still fights and guys being belligerent towards the reservists and that kind of thing. But it wasn't nearly to the degree that I've seen in other places.
So once you're together and you're starting your workup training, what are you doing and for how long at that time?
Workup training with the Strathconas. A lot of it was, simple stuff. Like the first 2 weeks where they were trying to get as many guys qualified on the platforms as they could. Because even though they brought in a ton of reservists, I think we were 40% reserve within the squadron, it wasn't enough. So they were running, Cougar driver courses, Cougar gunner courses, that kind of a thing. But once that happened, a lot of it was just a lot of stables type work. And stables is when, you go into the hangars and you work on the vehicles. And it may seem useless when you're about to deploy, but it helps in that you understand who knows what about the platform. So it's a really good place where you realize that the gunners know the gunnery and they know how to maintain their guns. That the drivers, can fix any problem within that vehicle. But it also helps in that the troop and the crews get to know one another, because you're working in confined spaces, sharing tools, and dealing with a lot of shit going south in terms of, it's small stuff, but it's, you get an oil leak that runs across the floor and all of a sudden that's a big deal, and, tempers flare, that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of that happening. But then there was also a lot of in-house exercises, like camp security type stuff. There was a lot of resiliency training. We didn't call it that back then, but it was basically stories of guys coming back from tours and not handling things well and what they did to cope. Giving us a little bit of an idea, a lot of lectures, on what was available in terms of support, in terms of what we need to do, personally for finances and for legal matters when we're away and that kind of a thing, wills, all that kind of stuff. There was also a lot of training and a lot of lectures on the rules of war and conduct in war zones and that kind of a thing. And then eventually we deployed to California, to Camp Pendleton, where the training was basically a 1 month long tour scenario. So there was the convoy escorts, there was the mounted recce's, the route recce's, the camp security, to all out combat. So it was definitely scaled, but it was like living in the camp, and we had all the arms there. We had the Patricia company there. We had the horse artillery battery, the service battalion. We had the entire battle group there, and we lived in the camp as we would overseas, and we trained everything, to incoming mortar attacks, to sniping attacks, to doing the jobs we would be doing, like I said before. And we did a lot of convoy escorts, a lot of route recce's, and OP duties, lots of OP work. Yeah, by the end of it, we felt pretty confident that we could do the job. And I think that training was actually quite good because it was very theater and belligerent centric. So we had a pretty good understanding as well what the weaponries, the weapon systems were that you would find in Yugoslavia, the immense capacity that these forces had. I mean, they had the third largest, military in Warsaw, in the Warsaw Pact. But we also understood how they worked and a little bit of the political underpinnings and the social differences and the cultural pressures and then the whole religious aspect of it. So a lot of it was, like I said, classrooms and bringing in speakers and subject matter experts to explain what it is that we're stepping into. And all that culminated, like I said, in California, where we lived the tour for a month. But I felt that training was actually really was right on the nose, because we ended up in theater, and there were a few things that caught us off guard, I believe, which was not the case for my second tour. The second tour was very skills, up to the squadron level, but very skills oriented, just practicing the skills, not really knowing what kind of scenario we were going into, and that's something we had to learn on the ground when we hit the ground. So, but yeah, anyways, that's what World Cup looked like back in '94.
Let's talk about when you were over there. Yeah. First impressions on your arrival. How did you arrive, and what did you think that very first day?
Yeah, it was. It's a heck of a way to start anything. We landed in Croatia, and then we had to do a road run from Croatia into Visoko, which was approximately 40 minutes outside of Sarajevo. So we landed in the afternoon. We packed into the back of MLs, and there must have been close to 20, 22 MLs, and 2 patrols of Cougars, so four Cougars providing protection. And we started late afternoon. We landed mid-afternoon, and then we took off. We got onto the trucks, grabbed our kit, and by late afternoon we were out on the road. And we basically drove overnight, which is the one thing they tell you not to do in theater, is, don't move at night. And we have, a third of the battle group in the back of MLs going over mountain passes through tiny little villages, and it's pitch black. And so it was must have been a 14-hour drive. It was long, and in the back of this ML, it's all dark, it's dusty, it's loud, and you're trying to catch glimpses of the countryside through the cracks in the tarp. Lights in the distance and tiny little roads and dogs barking and people on the road, and again, it's all going so fast, but you're also so tired, and so I think your imagination fills in half of what your reality is at that point, because your reality again is just noise, dust, and darkness, and just little glimmers of light coming through cuts in the tarp. And then every now and then you hear shots fired, and you giggle. I mean, there's not much else you can do, right? Every now and then the convoy stops, and you never really know why, and then it takes off, at a mad clip again. And then we finally pull into camp, and we're all sore, we're all tired, our brain is kind of spinning. It's still fairly dark, and we line up per squadrons, and we start clearing weapons, because by that point we got our weapons and ammo issued once we got in the back of the MLs in Croatia. And we get into camp and we start clearing weapons, and that was our first ND. Some guy about 10 guys down to my right is clearing his weapon and smashes one into the ground. So we weren't in camp for more than 5 minutes, and we had our first ND. So that was quite the experience. Automatically, of course, there's the NCOs from the previous tour who are rotating out but are still in charge of things. They come aboard this guy, like 5 of them yelling, and by this point you're going, okay, what the heck, let's just settle down and see what the hell's going on. So we get our welcome remarks from our OC and the outgoing OC, and then we get walked up by one of the 12th RBC Master Corporals up to our troop lines. So we kind of, there were still half the troop lines were still being occupied by the 12th RBC, and so wherever there was an empty bunk, we kind of put ourselves in. So for those first 2 or 3 weeks, we cohabited with the 12th RBC, and we worked together as well. So they, if we go on a patrol, it'd be one 12th RBC call sign, it'd be one Strathcona call sign, and they just showed us everything from where the fuel stations are to where we park the vehicles, and the regulations coming in and out of the camp, and including the surrounding countryside and what to look out for, and where the snipers are and the machine gun nests are, and where the battle lines are, that kind of a thing. So and that's all within the first 2 weeks.
So what's your job? And just maybe explain a little bit about a typical day or a typical week.
Sure. My job on that tour was as a Cougar driver. So I was a driver for the troop warrant. So there were 7 call signs in the troop, and each one of those call signs has a senior NCO, or at least a senior master corporal, and one officer in charge of each one of those call signs. I was a corporal back then, and I was a driver for the troop warrants call sign. Where that matters is because, first of all, when you deploy on a recce, usually recces were done by 2 call signs for 1 patrol. So my patrol was Alpha Patrol, and so tactically that matters because that means I'm always the second call sign. So the junior call sign always leads. I'm always in the second one, which means that we eat a lot of dust. So I was constantly covered in dust, and I was constantly cleaning out the air intakes and the engine because they were just covered in dust. It also matters administratively because being in the troop warrant's call sign, the troop warrant is never around. If he's playing troop warrant, then he's looking after the logistics and the administration of the troop. So he's talking to the sergeant major, he's talking to the squadron quartermaster, he's grabbing stuff, he's looking after the discipline of the guys and making sure that everybody's healthy. So as soon as we park somewhere, he's gone, we don't see him again. And then if the troop leader is tasked out or away on leave or needs to be deployed somewhere else with his patrol, then the troop warrant becomes obviously the troop leader. So again, then he's busy with the OC, he's busy doing planning, so we never see the man. My troop warrant, Warren Izzard, was a fantastic soldier, an amazing leader, but within the call sign, we never saw him. We always saw him in the troop lines, but within the call sign, he would be in the call sign when we deployed, when we were doing the job, but as soon as we stopped somewhere, we never saw him again. So my gunner and I were basically responsible for that vehicle. So everything from meals and water and ammunition and fuel and the maintenance and making sure that everything worked properly was my driver and I. So on that aspect, we were probably the busiest driver and gunner in that troop, simply because every other call sign had 3 personnel in it. Sometimes the troop leader would be away, but the troop leader would actually spend more time with his vehicle than even the troop warrant would. So it meant that we were very busy, even after the mission stopped. You know, it would be another 2 or 3 hours afterwards, just making sure the vehicle was ready to go the next day again for the next one. But on an average day, most of the work that we did was patrolling. So like I said before, it would be two Cougars normally heading out, and we'd be patrolling, presence patrolling a lot of it. A lot of it was just looking at the battle lines that were being drawn, if they had moved at all. And then also going up to the different OPs and that kind of thing, just making sure there was activity going on, and also, providing our guys a sense that, we're always out there for them as well. Because when you're an OP, you're kind of exposed. I mean, you have your vehicles and your weapons and everything, but still, it's just your patrol up in an OP. So to see another patrol coming through and saying hi, or just seeing them in your RX is, usually a morale booster. That's what patrolling looked like. We also did a lot of convoy escorts, or not convoy escorts, convoy or VIP escorts as well. So say if the OC or a battle captain needed to go into one of the main headquarters for one of the warring factions to negotiate or to call somebody out, one of our patrols would be attached to them. So we'd drive out, provide protection on the way out, and then provide protection on the ground for the VIP. Same thing if we had people from the UN or from NATO coming in from Sarajevo into the camp, we'd run out a patrol or 2 to bring them in. Another one that we did my squadron only did a few times, but Recce squadron quite a bit, was the bus run to Sarajevo, and that was an ugly one because we were getting civilians from Visoko into Sarajevo. This used to be a bus run, like regular, transit bus line in peacetime. It became the only way to transport people from Visoko to Sarajevo, but it could only be done once because it had to be done under protection, and that's what we provided. So this bus would get packed full of people that needed to go into Sarajevo, and then we put 2 Cougars, ahead in front of this bus and literally drive as fast as we could from Visoko to Sarajevo because the sniping and the machine gun fire into this bus was ridiculous. I can't remember a single run into Sarajevo that bus didn't get hit or didn't get fired at. So a lot of times we were using the Cougars as shields as soon as the fire started, or we'd just be going so fast we just couldn't move, but we just maintained that presence. Sometimes the guys would return fire, but I mean, it wasn't unusual to end up in, finally get to Sarajevo and have to, you know, help wounded, and every now and then, you know, people would be dead on that bus. So it was a nasty one. And then there was all the convoys as well that are coming in from the coast for resupply and that kind of a thing from Croatia. So we'd send 1 or 2 patrols out to protect these guys coming in over the mountain passes into Visoko as well. And some of the other jobs we did OPs as well. So we'd be posted up for a week in an OP over, you know, on a high feature overlooking the battle lines. And they're doing that traditional peacekeeping role, right, which is basically just writing down infractions and who shot when and time of, you know, infraction and so on. And that's actually where our main casualty was taken, was a troop horn from Recce Squadron that got shot in the back, was in one of those OPs there. Not glorious work, but it had to be done. And the last thing we did was we park our Cougars and we'd take LTIS out and do battle line inspections. So they would have trench lines and so on. And under the accord back then, the UN had right to go in and inspect to make sure that battle lines hadn't grown beyond to where they were supposed to be, and that they had the right amount of people and amount of weapons for those battle lines, for the trench lines. Those were interesting, you know, because it had nothing to do with, you know, with war fighting. It had everything to do with diplomacy and calling people out. Because every time we ended up somewhere, you knew that they were hiding something, or they'd done something and they didn't want to tell you about it, or it had some really good excuse as to why it happened. So you're sitting there basically just writing all the stuff down and just trying to call bullshit on stuff, and then go home and put in a report and see if anything comes from it.
How adequate was your equipment for the job you were doing, the Cougar in particular?
The Cougar was actually amazingly adequate. And the reason is that, first of all, because it is such a Canadian anomaly, the warring factions had no intelligence on this vehicle. So they would actually pay little kids to go in, and whenever we stopped somewhere, to try to sneak in a look to see what was in the back of these things. Because they didn't know about, all they knew is that we had a big gun in front, but they didn't know about, you know, coaxial weapons. They didn't know what the grenade dischargers were like. They didn't know what the armor on it was like, or how much ammunition we could carry in these things. So they had no idea. So a lot of it was the fact that they feared this thing because they didn't know what it could do. Of course, you and I know that it's a light armored vehicle, and, you know, it's not exactly a primary or a premium warfighting machine. But because they didn't know what it could do, it gave them pause quite often. But what I found was most adequate about that vehicle was that it has a ridiculous range for an armored vehicle. 500 kilometers in the armor world, it's almost unheard of. But it's also fast. You know, it can hit 100 kilometers per hour. Most of them can. And because it's not so big, it could get up into a lot of these cattle trails. A lot of the trench lines were up in these, you know, cattle trails up hills, and most vehicles couldn't get up there, but the Cougar could. So it was mobile, it was fast, and it could go for a long way. And the logistics on it are quite small compared to, say, you know, even a light tank, because it's, at the end of the day, it's a wheeled vehicle. And then when it came to weaponry, you know, the few times that the main gun fired, one time it did hit a T-54. The other times it made a really big mess on the side of a hill. So it got the point across. It was big enough to make a statement. And that coax and that thing back then, I think we already had the C6. So the C6 is actually a pretty nice weapon. It's reliable and it's accurate. And it had enough armor. The Cougar had enough armor to deflect the 14.7, which we found out firsthand. Would we want to go any harder than that? Absolutely not. But it could deflect the 14.7. So in that aspect, it was good. We did use the LTIS quite a bit to get into those really gnarly situations, you know, on top of hills and that kind of a thing. That obviously gives you pause. We weren't happy doing it. It was out of necessity more than anything, obviously. But my AMU, you know, where you attach the antenna to the vehicle, that got blown out, you know, just on a regular patrol coming into camp. Shot fired, the AMU just goes flying. Like, what if that, you know, if that round was 3 feet forward? I mean, it could have been ugly. And that was the thing, is that the belligerents had no qualms about taking shots at an Altus, and they did all the time. And it was pure luck that, you know, our guys didn't get, you know, weren't wounded by these incidents. The Cougar, they were a lot more unlike to fire, and when they did, it was with heavier stuff. And then it wasn't consistent because it didn't want to be around for the return fire. So, but the Altus, I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, it's basically a golf cart on 4x4 tires. So that obviously gave us pause. We had to use that vehicle, but we didn't like doing it. A lot of the guys, you know, put blast blankets on the floor, because again, one of the biggest threats in that theater was mines. But like I said, I mean, it's basically a golf cart. You had to put a lot of, you know, blast blankets down to have any real effect if you hit anything big. So that said, the engineers managed to use C4 and blast blankets to weather a blast on an M113. So maybe there's something to be said about C4 and blast blankets being really good at, you know, deflecting mine energy. Worked for them. Yeah.
How did the reality match your expectations for what you thought you were going to encounter there?
You know, it's funny. I've been thinking a lot about this, because I think that is where I think a lot of guys' problems after the fact arise from, is that the military does a very good job at preparing you tactically and technically for the job. Almost robotic to react to situations and for you to do the right thing according to, you know, to your SOPs and your drills. What it doesn't prepare you, and it quite likely can't, is prepare you for a new reality. And that is really what it comes down to, is when you're in theater, you have the skills, you have the knowledge, you have the drills. You're building your reality as you go along. Because there's no way, I mean, if you've never been in a situation, if you've never been in a geographic area, if you've never interacted with different people, there's no way that you can preconceive a reality that's going to match what's actually on the ground. So you hit the ground, you're doing a job, and I think that's what half your mind is doing, is trying to build a narrative, to put together a narrative that matches a reality that you're seeing. And I think a lot of the times that narrative doesn't fit, you know, to what we bring as people. And a lot of times that narrative also changes rather violently, even halfway through the tour. So you've spent half the tour building this narrative, this reality that matches your ability to understand and to accept. And then in an instant, you know, your world shifts upside down, and all of a sudden you have to start over again. Again, the military's prepare you to be that soldier, to do that job, and you can still do it, and you still do it very well. But internally, you know, I think that's where part of the problem is that you're still a human being trying to build a narrative that can sustain this reality that you're part of. So I probably have preconceptions going into this, and I think a lot of it dealt with instances, you know, that there would be instances where things would be dramatic and there would be violent, and there would be instances when, you know, it'd be tiring or be tender because you'd be able to interact with the population. And a lot of that did happen, but at the end of the day, it's not what life is really like, right? I mean, guys, I've been saying this since the beginning of time. It's 99% boredom. Most of the time, you're just going through motions. You know, getting ready for that thing that may never come. You know, maintaining vehicles and refueling and going over your ammo, make sure it hasn't been rusted out. Going to O groups and driving the same patrol route, you know, week after week after week. But then that in itself is is a reality you have to adjust to, and just juxtapose it with the fact that there's still this political, rambling going on, and it's still shaping everything around you. And that just when you think that things are normalizing, something else happens. Like a battle line moves forward, or a village gets bombed, or one of our own guys, gets targeted. Or you hear about, war atrocities, and you end up in these hospitals where, you see humanity at its worst and at its best. You see what children and human beings are exposed to, and what's left of them, and these people, who come after and sacrifice, life and mental health to do what they can to help these people. So even though a lot of the times you're sitting there bored and tired and unfocused, you know in the back of your mind that there's shit going on, and that that tomorrow can be a completely different day, because you can be watching CNN and all of a sudden Sarajevo's getting bombed, and what's that going to do for our battle lines? Or we had a resupply convoy coming in from the coast that just got shot to shit. Well, I mean, what's that going to do now? In terms of the UN, how they react to the situation. So you realize that, yeah, this is life. This is me, doing another oil change in my Cougar. But what's tomorrow going to bring? And none of it needs to be traumatic. You just know that your feet are never really are under you, right? It can be very small things. It can be a political decision, but that's going to affect eventually what you're doing on the ground. So, yeah, my preconceptions going in. Again, I think there were snippets. I think there were vignettes. I didn't really have the capacity to build a whole expectation of reality, what it was going to be like. And maybe that's better. I do know that there's guys that do build, the entire reality before they get to theater. I don't imagine that helps, because there's no way your reality can meet, or your conception of reality can meet what you're actually going to find on the ground. But regardless, at the end, you leave theater with a different sense of reality, and a very different narrative than what you thought you were going to come up with, or come into it with.
You've talked about a couple of incidents, but is there one day or one incident that, good or bad, stands out for you?
There's a few, I guess. Yeah, and it's funny because as a tour, we had a couple really rough days, or a few rough days. We're lucky that we didn't lose anybody. We had 2 wounded, but we didn't actually have to drape a coffin. And for that, I feel very, very fortunate. But yeah, I mean, there were incidents that really shaped us as a battle group, but those, I mean, I accept those. They're part of my experience, but they don't really resonate with me as much as what I'm about to tell you. The one thing that as a person probably affected me the most was the children's hospital on the outskirts of our AOR, and that is exactly what it was. We came up to this hospital to make sure that things were okay, because it was abandoned as soon as the war came through. It was abandoned, and it used to be in the Muslim side. And but I mean, what ended up happening is that most of the staff, when violence took root, basically left. And these children were sick to begin with. A lot of them had acute illnesses. Some of them had mental health issues. Some of them were just babies, and they were left. Eventually, some nurses and a doctor, heard about this, and they went in and basically took over this hospital. They didn't have any supplies. They didn't have the staff to man it. They barely had any food. So when the Canadians heard about it, we gave them a generator. We brought in some water, some food, and we just kind of checked on them to make sure they were okay. But when you went into that hospital, I mean, the smell stays with you. I mean, it is when people say that it smells like death, that is exactly what it is. And not only, at a physiological level, it affects you, because that kind of smell has a physical reaction in your body. But then when you start walking the hallways and you see who the patients are, who these dead bodies are. I mean, it's kids, you know, missing limbs. You can see gangrene sitting in on a lot of these kids. Some of them are so malnourished. Lots of crying, and some of them just can't even cry anymore, right? They've been there for so long, they're so tired, they're so near death. And it's amazing, some of them just want to be held, you know, like even my troop horn and myself, you know, we picked up a couple of these babies and they just want to be held. You know, they quiet down and you walk by them and they reach out to you, and simple things like that they have no affordances for. And going through there and seeing what these kids were going through, seeing some of them dead, some of them dying, and knowing that there's nothing anybody, even if you brought in a modern medical facility, you wouldn't be able to help some of these kids. They're just that done. And then to see, you know, this handful of people trying to do the best of a really bad situation. Yeah, it sticks with you. You know, that's one of the things that one of the few things that as a troop we had to debrief afterwards. You know, it's we had a few guys who just couldn't handle it. You know, they had to leave. Parents, you know, both of them. Guys breaking down, and it's overwhelming. You know, it doesn't affect you personally. You know, like you come in, you're not in any danger. You know, you had nothing to do with their state of being at that moment, but it affects you at a human level, right? Yeah, I think if anything, it helped to focus, you know, why we're there. The battle group is a warfighting machine, but in that moment we felt we had even a bigger calling, you know. We went into Bosnia almost looking for a fight, and we realized that the fight looked a little bit differently there. That we were willing to fight if we needed to fight, but that our energies were spent better elsewhere. So, and mainly to stop that from happening again, and secondly to help these people in whatever way we could. So that was one of them. But on a good note, on a positive note, every now and then we had to do camp security. So I ended up doing a lot of front gate duty. Well, not a lot. I probably spent 3 weeks of my tour on the front gate. But in those 3 weeks, I realized there were these little kids who used to hang out in front of the gate, right? And they're there just hanging out because they're bored or asking for candy. And but one of them just kind of stood out. You know, she was a little girl. She looked like she was 8 years old. And she was there first thing in the morning and was there almost until it got dark, and just, you know, hung around playing with friends, and then friends would leave, and then another group of kids would show up and she'd play with them too. And, you know, and if she was alone, she'd just toss rocks into the street. And every now and then she'd come up to the Canadian soldiers, you know, and just say whatever, and then go back to her little seat and chuck more stones. And so one day, me bored and curious, I called the interpreter up, the on-duty interpreter that day. She wasn't doing anything. So, you know, there's something about this girl. She's always here. You know, she should be at home or at school, but she's always here, and she's super friendly, and all the kids seem to like her. And she comes up to us and talks to us every now and then. None of us know what she's talking about. Help me out. So we struck this sort of conversation, and this little girl's name was Sanella, and her dad and her uncle had been killed in the war, and it was just she and her mother, I think, at that point. I think there was a sister somewhere, but I didn't really understand or recall whether she was still part of the family unit. But at that point, it was just she and her mother, and her mother was basically spending all her waking hours working to try to get herself and her daughter out of this mess they found themselves in. So she really had nowhere else to go. Her mom was working this whole time, and she didn't have support network, and she wasn't from Vesico. So she just found a safe place outside our camp where she made friends and met people and just hung out until she could go home again. But this little girl, she was so beautiful, you know? Someone sent me contact with her. You know, she asked for me, you know, when I was coming back up. So every time I came up to the gate for gate duty, she'd come up and start talking, and I'd call up the interpreter, and we have a little chat. And we ended up striking a little bit of a friendship. And as it turns out, she was actually 13, not 8, but she was so small because, you know, 3 years of war, and just at that critical time when kids are supposed to grow, she was just tiny. So she was 13, which is why she also seemed rather poetic and eloquent when she spoke, and I was blown away by this 8-year-old who could speak the way she could and frame things the way she could. She was a lot older than she seemed. So we struck this little friendship, and every now and then I would sneak some candy for her, and she'd leave me notes at the gate and this kind of stuff. And then when we got our redeployment date, she wasn't there, so I told one of her friends to tell her, look, tell Sanella that I'm leaving this day, and I really like to see her one more time, just say goodbye, kind of a thing. And so that day we all lined up, and I went up to the front gate, and she wasn't there. So I got on the bus, and the bus is driving out of the front gate, and I can see her running down the street. And it was one of those clear window buses. So she's looking madly at this bus, you know, going from face to face to face, and she saw my face, and then she started like waving madly. So I waved back at her, and that was our goodbye. And it's ironic because, you know, every tour you get a tour picture, right? And I remember years ago looking for my tour picture for that tour, and I couldn't find it. What the heck? Where did it end up? So as it turns out, Sanella survived the war, and she found me on Facebook about 2 years ago. And, you know, she goes, I don't know if you remember, but this is me, and this is how I know you. And like, yeah, of course I know you. I'll never forget her. And so we started talking, you know, back and forth a little bit, best you can through Google Translate. And this last Remembrance Day, she said, I have a present for you. I go, yeah, what is it? And she scanned my tour photo. I had left it with her, and I completely forgot about it. In one of these crazy interactions that we had together, she wanted something from me, and the only thing I had to give was this picture. So I gave her this picture, and she sent it back to me via Facebook, like, that's where it was. Of course, I completely forgotten. But yeah, I don't know why. I mean, in that craziness that was that war, Sanella was just a complete opposite. Just a position of everything that was going on, and that was good and fine, and that could be. She suffered a lot, and she was still a beautiful soul, you know. I don't know, and that stuck with me. Yeah. But yeah, if I had to pick 2 incidents, that's probably them.
What was it like? I know I'm conscious that we're running out of time here. Tell me how you came home. What was it like coming home after this kind of an experience?
Yeah, home was hard. I tried not to come home. I heard of guys in Croatia putting in for tour extensions, and I tried my damnedest to do that. It was such a raw experience emotionally. Like I said, it was just to see such evil and ugliness, and then to see such beauty, because the countryside too is beautiful. The culture is beautiful. The people, when they're trying to kill each other, are really just, you know, nourishing, welcoming, warm people. So to see these polar opposites try to dance with one another, to me, it was just fascinating, and it was almost like a drug to my soul. I couldn't take enough of it. I volunteered for everything that came out because I wanted to be out. I wanted to see more. I wanted to do more. I wanted to meet more people. Near the end, my Serbo-Croat actually got pretty good, to the point that my troop one would just call me up and go like, "Yeah, make sure the interpreter is saying what we're saying." Obviously, it was never that good, but people just knew that I was building this affinity for it, and so yeah, I I was living on a high when I was there. Of course, there's the adrenaline that goes with, you know, incidents and engagement and all that kind of stuff. But it was just being there. This whole experience to me was just was intoxicating. I didn't want to come home. They turned me down for a tour extension because this is also about the same year when they, or the same time when they realized that those extended tours in Croatia was messing people up. And no matter how much I told them that I'm doing really good, like this is awesome, I want to be here, they weren't buying it. Looking back, they were probably right. So coming home I reluctantly came home. And I realized then that also that within a couple of weeks of being home, that as intense as that experience was, it was fleeting. That wasn't my life. It couldn't define me and it wouldn't define me, and I had to get my shit together and get back to school and, you know, do something to build a life on. But I really didn't want to. I fought it. I knew it cognitively that that's what I wanted to do, but emotionally I wasn't there. So what happens when that happens is you drink a lot. Like a lot of my friends did. In the King Zone, because there were so many of us, you know, we'd get together and just spend so much money and so much time drinking. And I think 6 months of my life after that tour just disappeared, you know. I do know I have PTSD. I don't think it's from that tour. But again, how do you ever know? How do you ever know? But I did self-medicate to a great degree, and to this day I wonder why. Maybe it was just the fact that I was high for so long, you know, for 6 months, just living life to that degree, that everything else just seemed boring and bland and pedestrian. And going out every night and drinking way too much was probably as close as I could possibly get without, you know, doing something criminal. But yeah, you know, it ended up being about a year worth of transition to get back into life the way it was supposed to be. I got back in the King Zone right away. You know, as soon as I could. So I started working with a unit that helped, and then I went back to school, and that also helped. But yeah, it was really hard to leave a life behind that had so much meaning, you know, so much purpose. And like I said in the beginning, even if it was idealistic and misplaced, in the moment it feels like that you finally have a purpose in the world, that there's meaning in your life, and that cougar is not going anywhere unless you're doing your job properly, and that this crew is not coming home unless you're doing your job properly. And then to go from there to just being Joe Blow in the street with zero responsibility and so little purpose that if you don't get out of bed in the morning, it doesn't matter. You could literally spend weeks in bed and it wouldn't matter a bit. So to go from that end of the spectrum to where you don't have to get out of bed in the morning, I found that hard. I found that very hard.
It's 12:20 now. You mentioned that you had to get going.
I do.
Is there anything that you haven't said that you really wanted to say before you have to leave?
Sure. One thing. I struggled for years after my tours in Bosnia. I couldn't disconnect. And I honestly feel that in the beginning it was that physiological response to living that kind of experience. But I think more so is the fact that you give a lot of your life and soul to these kinds of missions. But you never see the end of it, right? Like, and I'm sure that, you know, the tours that come from now on, because this is the way the world is, are going to be just the same. Like in World War II, there was an end, and everybody came home, you know, to flags waving, and to marches, and recognizing the end of war, and the rebuilding could happen. and there was armistice between the war fighters. I never saw that, right? That I gave of myself to this mission, and I never saw its conclusion. I think Bosnia is somewhat where it's going to be for a while, and it is stable, but I never saw it. And I never saw the results. I never saw the end. I never saw the critical point where you can take a breath and go, ah, right, that's why all this mess. And again, and I'm sure Afghanistan is going to be the same thing. The next tour we go to, it's going to be the same thing. Is that you don't see the end of it. You don't have that clear demarcation line where you can cross over and go, right, it's done. We came here what we wanted to do. We achieved the aim. We can go home and get on with the next phase. That never comes. Because for 10 years, even after my last tour, Bosnia was still a thing. The political ramifications were still being felt. The tension was still there. War was still going on, even in pockets, years after my first tour. So you go in, you shoot in, you get plucked out. You never have that. You never make peace with what you did because you were literally just a pawn in space. And then you get yanked out to do whatever you need to do for yourself after that. But you never see it to the end. You never see why the sacrifice, why the time, why the investment, physical and emotional. And so this is something I only came to in the last actually few months, believe it or not, that I think that's why I held on to it for so long. I don't hold on to it anymore. I treasure my time there, both tours, but I don't cling to it like I did for a very long time. But again, I think the reason I clung to it the way I did was because there wasn't that finalization. When we left, Sarajevo was on fire. So we spent all this time and all this ammo and all this fuel and food and money and human energy. And that's not to say we shouldn't have done it. It's just that, and I truly believe we did what we had to do, and I hope we would do it again if faced with the same circumstances. But in the individual level, you don't ever see your contribution lead to anything. It's small, right? Like my relationship with Sanella, the generator in the hospital. You see these things, but you don't ever see the culmination of it. And I think that's why it stuck with me for so long.
Like no closure. Basically.
No closure. Yeah, exactly. And like I said, I mean, Bosnia is a much better place now, obviously. But I didn't see it. I didn't get to witness it or experience it. I just experienced it when it was really bad. And I never got to feel that closure of what the world community did there. So.
Would you go back just to take a look?
It's on my bucket list. Yeah, beautiful roads there. Not beautiful like we know them, but they're winding up and down, mountain passes, through colorful little villages. My bucket list is me and my motorcycle, and all those, I think, what was it? 100,000 kilometers we put in on patrols. Do those on a bike. I would love to do that. And maybe if part of me still needs a little bit of closure, I'm not sure it does, but if part of me does, that would do it. But at the end of the day, I want to reconnect, for sure. I would like to see what that country's like now.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Time does fly, eh?